Good evening, and welcome to our first seminar of this new year, 2008. Our seminar tonight is about the Bible, the history of the Bible, and answering the question, is it reliable and true? Well, when we look at the Bible, and we consider the Bible, it is a great work. But the first thing I want to do is deal with some, what we will call fast facts on the Bible. The Bible consists of 66 books that are broken into two sections. There's the Old Testament, or actually the word that's used is covenant. The Old Covenant, which consists of 39 books, and then there is the New Testament, or the New Covenant, consisting of 27 books. When I was in confirmation, my dad, of course, expected us to know everything that we could know about the Bible. And so he gave us a little hint here on how to remember the number of books in the Bible. All you have to remember is the Old Testament. There's 39 books in the Old Testament. If you take the two digits from 39, 3 and 9, and multiply them together, that gives you 27. Well, that's the number of books in the New Testament. And then if you add that 27 and the 39, well, then you got your 66. But when it comes to the Bible and looking at the languages of the Bible, we're dealing with three different languages. The Old Testament was written almost entirely in the Hebrew language. There is some Aramaic, which is found in Daniel chapter 2, 42 to 7:28, Jeremiah 10:11, and then again in the book of Ezra, Ezra 4:8 to 6:18, and Ezra 17 verses 12 to 26. The New Testament originally was written entirely in Greek. Who did write the Bible? Well, in the Old Testament, we're dealing with Moses, prophets, kings such as David, and some scribes. The New Testament, written by the apostles and the evangelists. And the message is very consistent. The Old Testament message can be summed up basically in this: the God of creation makes a covenant with his people and promises a Savior or a Messiah. And let me just take a moment here to explain what a covenant is. A covenant is a two-way promise. In the Old Testament, that covenant was summed up in, I will be your God, you will be my people. As our God, God promises to take care of us, provide for us in every way, including the most important way, giving us the Savior Messiah. And our part of it is to love God, serve him, and live for him. In the New Testament, the message is a continuation. The God of the covenant fulfills the covenant and makes salvation available to all mankind. The Old Testament's configuration, well, the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, broke it up, a little bit differently than we do. They have the law, which is also called the Pentateuch. It's the first 5 books, the books of Moses, going from Genesis to Deuteronomy. Then they would have the prophets, which they broke into 2 subgroups. There were the former prophets, which were Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. And then there were the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of 12, which is what we would now know as the minor prophets. Then they would have the writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Put it all together, you have the 39 books that we have today. When we look at the Old Testament configuration in the English, well, that goes back to the Septuagint. I'll talk more about the Septuagint in a bit. But the Septuagint was a Greek version of the Old Testament. And there it started with the 5 books of the law, the Pentateuch, then 12 books of history, Joshua through Esther, then 5 books of poetry, Job through the Song of Solomon, and then 17 books of the prophet, which were broken into 2 groups. The major prophets, Isaiah through Daniel, the minor prophets, Hosea through Malachi. Now please understand when these terms are used, major and minor, this is not referring to, oh, this is a major prophet, he's a big one, oh, this is a minor prophet, he really didn't do that much for God. No, the major prophets are the books that are the longest, and the minor prophets are simply books that are shorter. When we look at the Bible, And these people who wrote it, what did they use? Well, this is critical to our study here tonight. Papyrus was one of the most common things to be used. It comes from the plant of that name, and it was a type of paper. You would take this plant and you would cut it. It was a reed, and you would cut it into strips. You would peel it. You'd lay it out to dry, and then you would glue these strips together to form a single piece or a scroll. The other thing that was used is parchment, which is animal skins. The Jewish Talmud required that the Torah be copied on animal skins. The early Latin Bibles, those written from 300 AD and forward, were written in codex or book form, and they were written on parchment. And parchment lasts much longer. Papyrus, well, being plant material, it breaks down rather quickly and rather easily. The time frame, when was all of this written? Well, the Old Testament was written between 1400 and 400 BC. The New Testament was written between the year 40 and 95 AD. When we look at this, we'll break it down a little bit further and why we say, for the New Testament between 40 and 95. The book of Revelations is the hardest one to date. There's three different thoughts on Revelations. The first thought is that it was written somewhere between 54 and 68 during the reign of Nero. And when you look at Revelations, it speaks in very figurative language, and it speaks about the coming doom and all that's coming. And many people see that as a foretelling of what's coming upon Jerusalem. And we know that Jerusalem was destroyed in 70. We know that the great persecution began under Nero. So there's those who date it between 54 and 68. There are those who date it between 69 and 79 under the reign of Vespasian. And they basically are again going with the idea that, Revelation speaks of persecution and all, and John being on the island of Patmos, it probably happened during that time. And then there are those who believe that it was written toward the end of John's life, somewhere around AD 95. What's our thought here at Zion? We would hold to the earlier writing, 54 to 68 for Nero. But really, no one can know for sure, because we don't have the original book of Revelations that has a date on it. But when we look at the other writings in the New Testament, for instance, Paul's writings, we know that they must have been written prior to AD 64 to 67, because we know that it was sometime between that time frame, 64 and 67, that Paul died. So his books had to have been written before that. Peter, we know, was crucified in AD 64. So Peter's writings were written before AD 64. James, prior to AD 62, because that's when he died. Jude, probably before AD 67. We don't know exactly when he died. Tradition has it that it was in AD 67. Luke, it had to be prior to AD 84, because that's when he passed away or was killed. Mark, prior to AD 68. Again, that was his death. Matthew, we don't know. One reference says he preached in Ethiopia for 15 years. Another says he was martyred in Ethiopia. This would put his gospel prior to AD 50. Other scholars object on the grounds that Jesus couldn't have predicted the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, and therefore assign it a date after that time. Again, this depends on who you're going to go with. There are writings from first century, references that speak about Matthew preaching for 15 years in Ethiopia, and that he was martyred in Ethiopia. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to put those two together and go, okay. The disciples were in Jerusalem for a couple of years after Jesus ascended into heaven. But if Matthew went to Ethiopia for 15 years, let's say he went AD 35, 2 years after Jesus ascended into heaven. He preached there for 15 years. and he was martyred in Ethiopia. That would put it at AD 50, his death. The idea that